So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending our webinar today on how to prepare a well-written RFP for document remediation. Just a little bit of quick housekeeping before we get started. On the Zoom toolbar, if you're having any technical issues, Susan Lee will be monitoring our chat. So if you have any questions, have any audio issues or other issues that you need to bring to our attention, feel free to reach out on the chat box, and she can help you with any of those questions. During the presentation or at the end of the presentation, we will be taking some Q&A. So if you have questions that you think of during the presentation, just click on the Q&A button and go ahead and ask your questions now. And then once we get into that section, we will do our best to answer your questions and see what we can do for you. So with that, let's get started with our presentation today. So I'm David Herr. I'm the Director of Marketing here at CommonLook. I've been working in the accessibility field for going on 9 years now. And my colleague today that will be presenting as well is Megan Carey, who's our Senior Document Accessibility Consultant. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan.
Thanks, Dave. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Before we get started and focus on the background of writing a well-written RFP, I want to talk a little bit about who we are at CommonLook. So CommonLook has been in the document accessibility space for a little over 20 years now. We have an office in Washington, D.C., Canada, and Australia, so we're spread out pretty well. We not only offer remediation services, but we also offer software. So we do about over 1 million documents annually. But we will also take the extra step to teach you how to remediate in-house using our software. We have a very robust training department that will teach you exactly what we're doing when we remediate documents ourselves. And today being the focus of writing an RFP for remediation, that comes in handy because we can talk a little bit more about what we're doing when we remediate. So the focus of the conversation today, Dave, if you want to go to the next slide, Dave and I have worked together a lot on a lot of different RFPs pertaining to remediation and just accessibility in general. And what we found is there is a pretty large gap between the communication of what a client wants and what is actually being written in the RFP. So as a vendor, this communication gap really affects how we respond. And what we come to find out through asking more questions and getting more details of what a vendor or a client actually wants. And then we take a look at what was written in the RFP, and we found that it's not really communicated well. So whether you're a client on the call or if you're a vendor that also responds to these RFPs, we felt that this topic would be very relevant to get the conversation going about how to communicate what your actual needs are. So some of the things that we're going to dive into is getting the best price. What does that mean? Finding qualified vendors, and the language that is actually written in the RFP to get us to that point. So as a self-proclaimed shopaholic, I'm always going to try to find the best price for anything that I bring into my house. But at the same time, I always make a joke to my husband that it's sometimes a surprise on what actually arrives at my house, because I might be looking for a better price over what I'm actually looking for. You got to really look at the details. So I always talk very highly about the Amazon return policy. And basically when it comes to RFPs, that's what happens. You've got to look at the beginning of what you're trying to say that you want, so that at the end, when the package ends up on your doorstep, it's not going to be something that you didn't want, regardless of what the price is. So today we're going to dive into that. We're also going to touch base on the language in the proposals so that you are making sure it's the right vendor that's doing the work you're looking for. Through experience, we've run into that a few times where it may not have been conveyed on what the actual client wants. which also goes back to the language in the proposal. So Dave, if you want to go to the next slide, we have taken about 8 of our top topics that we found within a proposal for the RFP that just really isn't clear. And we wanted to have a perspective be put out there from a vendor of how we're trying to support the client and bring to the table what they want and what they need. And because these items aren't clear, it just ends up with a lot of confusion and a lot of extra work that I know other vendors as well as the clients really don't want to have to deal with. They just want to get the end product and be what they're looking for. So some of the topics we're going to touch base on is clarity on the bid process, more than one format for documents. This is a topic that a lot of people don't touch base on. There's different ways that we remediate. So if there's going to be different formats, we need to know. The more we know, the better we can provide a more robust response. The complexity of the documents, that is a very critical point when it comes to remediation. Testing standards and compliance. If you're looking for a remediation service, there's no way to really know if you're getting the work that you want without testing it. So we should all be on the same page about how we're testing it. Reference checks and software tools. We're going to talk about the growth of this industry in regards to accessibility and how there are a lot more tools coming out. And having an understanding of what those tools are and how to check them is very critical when making decisions on who you want to have perform this work. Fillable forms is a very hot topic for us because it kind of shows the different types of documents and how they do range in complexity. We'll touch base that on a little bit further, but if you have one price for all, fillable forms is where it really stands out because it really shouldn't be the same price for a fillable form and a regular document. And we'll go into that further. Sample documents, believe it or not, there are a lot of RFPs that are put out and then there aren't any documents that are shared for a vendor to evaluate. So kind of touching base on the critical need for a vendor to see the actual documents. And then vetting vendors. We're going to touch base on the growth of this area, which we already referenced. But because of that, there are a lot of vendors that are diving into the remediation space, which is great. Accessibility is something that we want to be everywhere. But making sure that the vendors are actually doing remediation and not just tagging a document or you know, just doing a Q&A rather than actually doing the work is really important to know who you're working with and what their expertise might be. So without further ado, Dave, if you want to start diving into some of these topics, I'll hand it over to you.
Absolutely, thank you. So let's jump into this. So let's face the facts. We all know that most organizations put out an RFP to find the lowest price for a project. I mean, that's everybody's goal. You lay out the specs and then you're looking for how can we get that lowest price to bring value to our organization. Everybody's being careful with their funds and everybody, we understand that completely. But when you choose the lowest price in an RFP and it isn't an apples to apples comparison, it's going to ultimately hurt your organization. You're not going to get what you're paying for. You may have to redo work. You may have liability and other issues that all come with if the scope isn't clearly defined, you're going to have problems. So you got to have clarity in that bid process. So if you're going to have a bid form that every vendor is going to fill out, you want to make sure that what's on that bid form is clearly defined. The scope of the project is completely understood. We've seen proposals where the vendor or the organization can't give a fixed page count. So they'll give estimates, but they want a fixed price. So they want to know a fixed price of X amount for a particular project, but they can't give the vendors or any of the vendors the entire scope of the project. They can't give us the whole number of pages. or they can't give you how many documents or even details on some of the types of documents. So you have to be able to define the scope. You have to be able to give that information to the people doing the bidding so that they're all comparing the same thing. We all understand the exact same size of this project, and then we can determine what is our price to do the work properly. We see these bid forms in one or two forms. One is, I want to get a price on an entire project, one-stop shopping. I pay X amount of dollars and I get a complete project completed. The second kinds of these RFPs that go out is to get pricing on particular types of content that will then be used for ongoing work as projects occur. And there's nothing wrong with that as well. That bid form for that type of a project needs to then define each type of content. As Megan said earlier, is it fillable forms are going to be at a different rate than simple content or more complex content, or content that's scanned has to be OCR'd and then tagged and then remediated. So getting clarity in the bid process, getting those bid forms clearly understood so that any vendor filling it out is going to do it based on all the right facts, all the same facts, and then it's going to be their price. So let's talk about documents for a minute. Pretty much content that is document-based is going to be PDF. I've been doing this for 9 years, and when we first would start talking to clients about this 9 or 10 years ago, everybody was working on their websites, they were working on their HTML, and documents were really kind of an afterthought, and they were not looked at in the way they are today. A lot of organizations that have helped fix their website have had to go back to the table when they discovered exactly how much of their content is in PDF format. And many websites have historical information with PDFs going back 8, 9, 10 years. The majority of those older documents are most definitely not created with accessibility in mind. The second type of documents that we see on websites is Office documents, Microsoft Office documents. So they're not out there nearly as much as PDF, but they do tend to be out there. And we also hear a lot of, well, we're moving away from PDF and we're moving to EPUB, or we're moving to something else. And there's nothing wrong with that. And if you have a method to move your content either into HTML or to EPUB or something else, anything you can do to make your content more accessible is there's nothing wrong with that. But the reality is most organizations are still continuing to use PDF, and they'll continue to use PDF into the future, which means we now have to make sure that those PDF documents are accessible on our websites. So let's talk about PDF and Microsoft Office documents. As I said earlier, PDF documents are the primary content that's uploaded to the web. But what we see on a lot of RFPs, and where this becomes a problem, is, it's a document accessibility remediation RFP for, let's say, 10,000 documents on a website. It needs to be done by a particular date and to a particular standard. Oftentimes these RFPs will try to lay out, what's the testing criteria, how are documents going to be confirmed to be accessible, and they'll be talking about both PDF and Office. And lots of times then what they'll do is they'll say, okay, you need to use Adobe Acrobat's accessibility checker as your test to confirm the documents are all accessible. And there's two problems with that. The first problem with that is that the Adobe checker doesn't confirm that PDFs meet a particular standard, but it does confirm that they meet particular accessibility criteria. It'll check for alt text, it'll check for heading levels and things like that, and it'll alert you to what you need to do to go back and fix it in the document. But it's not going to certify the document. It's not going to say that the document is WCAG 2.1 compliant. And then oftentimes, they'll list the Adobe checker for any and all documents must be tested with that. And you can't test an Office document with Adobe's checker. It's designed for PDF. What you can do is you can check it with the Microsoft accessibility checker, which is built into Office. But again, it has some of the same concerns as the Adobe checker. It's looking for accessibility, best practice content. It's not looking at, WCAG compliance. It's certainly not certifying a document to PDF UA or anything like that. It is strictly looking at accessibility, compliance, common issues that you should definitely fix in your document if you're authoring using Office. So what we recommend is on an RFP where you're going to have documents and you're going to have multiple documents, you need to seriously look at moving those Office documents over to PDF. Convert them to PDF. If they're up on your website, it's typically not because they need to be modified anyways. They're typically up there because they're either reporting or publishing or budget or whatever they're up there for. Convert them to PDF. Then the PDFs can be set up as properly tagged, can be made as accessible as the other PDF documents that are on your website. And then you can test them against one standard using one tool and be certain that the content is accessible up on your website. So dealing with PDFs and Office documents and RFPs, that can definitely be an issue. So the next thing we want to talk about is the complexity of documents. And the issue here is, you know, when somebody's putting out an RFP, and again, that hypothetical 10,000 documents, let's say it's 27,000 pages of content, and I want a price to do that entire project. Well, you know, if all 10,000 of those documents were simple text, maybe 2 columns of text and no images and stuff like that, and they're not scanned, they're actually just content, those would probably be the lowest cost documents to have remediated. They're simple, they still require a manual review, but they are not going to take as much time to go through, check the tagging, correct the tagging, check the reading order, those other things that are part of a remediation process. Documents that are more complex, that have tables or lots of alt text descriptions, are going to add to that cost per page. One area that comes up in a lot of these RFPs is who does the alt text. And that needs to be clearly defined in the RFP. And here's the reason why. For large projects, especially projects that have technical documents where the images and the drawings and the charts in these documents are not something that just the average person, you know, somebody doing remediation, could look at those images and accurately describe those images. You know, if they're not an engineer, for example, and you're looking at a road project, what information is trying to be conveyed by including that chart or that graph in a particular document. So you may need to have a subject matter expert who actually reviews the alt text or writes the alt text for those technical drawings, those technical documents. So those kinds of things need to be defined in the RFP so that, you know, you're getting, it's been handled properly. It's going to be addressed by all the vendors that are bidding on the project, and they know that they either need to provide subject matter expertise or the customer is going to supply that, and it's understood in the RFP at the bidding process. You know, the other thing as far as complexity is that bulk projects are going to help lower the overall cost. So if you have a large number of documents, even if they're complex, it's going to lower that overall cost per page. It's a volume thing. And the one thing I want to mention as well is in the last couple of years, with a lot of new companies getting into the accessibility field, and the document accessibility component of accessibility has continued to grow, there's been a lot of new tools coming out on the market or being ported on the market to do auto tagging or to do automation. You're going to see a lot of, you know, the latest darling buzzwords like, you know, AI and machine learning and all this other stuff around accessibility. And there's no question that these tools aren't necessary. Here at Common Look, we use automation and we use lots of tools in the back end to assist us in the remediation process. But you'll hear this oftentimes from a lot of the web accessibility companies and the audit companies that do web accessibility work. An automated tool is only going to get you 30% or 40%. It can't do everything. It can check for alt text. It can check for heading levels, presence of heading levels. It can look at reading order. It can look at metadata and some of the other things that need to be in a document for it to be standards compliant. But it, despite, you know, the best wishes of everyone and a lot of the amazing advances in AI and things like that, you know, a computer's not going to be able to look at an image and necessarily understand the reason that image is in a document to be able to auto-generate alt text for that image, as an example. There's going to be lots of other manual checks that need to be verified in a document for it to be standards compliant. So these automated tools are useful and they're part of the process, but you got to be wary of you get a quote or you get a winner of an RFP and they're saying they're basically using some kind of automation tool to do the majority of the remediation. You really need to be careful and you need to vet what the results are going to be from that tool, because you may be getting a lot less than what you think you're paying for. So let's talk about testing for compliance. One of the problems in this field is there isn't like a universally accepted report for confirming that documents are fully compliant to the standards. There really isn't one on the website HTML side either. Lots of organizations have testing tools. There's lots of organizations that have manual testers that do testing with screen readers and things like that, but there isn't like a one-stop shop report that you can run that is 100% everything, and that the federal courts and the judges and everyone all accept as, yes, this is proof of compliance. So what we see in a lot of RFPs is, because there isn't a checker or there isn't a universally accepted tool, everyone will put that, okay, the documents must pass the Adobe accessibility checker, which is not a problem, and it's a good first step. So many times that's listed on RFPs. We oftentimes will also see on RFPs that'll say that they recommend or they want the documents to be tested by using an AT technology like a screen reader. And there's nothing again wrong with that. But you do have to question who's doing the testing and how are the documents being tested. Are they being tested by like a third-party auditor? Are they being tested by somebody who uses the screen reader, as on a daily basis? That could be a proper test that they can fill out your form, or that they can truly read the document as it's intended. Color contrast has to be tested, and that's not included in the Adobe Accessibility Checker. It needs to be tested separately with other tools that are out to test color and contrast. There are some good third-party free tools that are available for doing compliance testing on PDFs. What they will do is create for you a report that lists, according to the WCAG standards or PDF UA checkpoints, that a document either passes or fails based on what it can do in a report. But do understand that those reports are limited. Common Look has taken our basically the reporting side of our Common Look PDF tool, and we've given that away to the industry as a free tool that anyone can download. It's called Common Look PDF Validator, and it'll generate a PDF report, checkpoint by checkpoint, showing compliance or lack of compliance for any documents that you test against it. That's not saying that it's going to address every single thing. There's still, you're just going to check for color contrast. It doesn't do that. And it is subject to the person that's running the tool to do some manual verifications, because there is somebody, a human, that has to verify that yes, the alt text is there and it's appropriate, so that passes and that checks and you can move on. So there are tools that are out there for compliance. We do recommend that people look a little bit broader than just using the Adobe Checker. And if you are testing it with screen reader, make sure that you have people that are doing the QA that are qualified to use a screen reader. With that, I'll turn it back over to Megan.
Thanks, Dave. So for this topic, we're talking about the risk of non-compliance. There's been a very, very large increase in the litigations that have taken place over the last year, last couple years. As Dave mentioned, both of us have been doing this for 8 years, almost 8 years. And in the beginning, a lot of people didn't know what accessibility was. Now, when I go to any website, I usually find the accessibility tab. There's been a lot of changes, a lot of awareness. Just going through the COVID updates that we receive, there's someone sitting right next to the speaker doing sign language, which is great. So the awareness has really kicked up the fact that communication has to be for everyone. especially during a critical time that we're in right now. When something is posted, it has to be available to everyone, and it's just expected that way. So if you do have a website that's not compliant and you do have PDFs on your site that are not compliant, there's been a lot more action that's been taken place than there has been in a lot of recent years, which is a great way to communicate with everyone and have everyone get the same information. So that being said, Dave, if you want to go to the next slide, because of this uptick in the need for accessibility, as Dave mentioned, there are a lot of different vendors that are taking on the task of remediation. So some vendors are working with a client and maybe they provide translation services. And the client says, hey, we need our documents remediated as well. So now the translation provider will now take a stab at trying to do remediation. So a lot of times when an RFP goes out, people that are diving into this remediation area are responding to these RFPs, which is great. But when there are really big, robust documents that need to be remediated in a specific time frame, we're finding that organizations that don't do PDF remediation as a primary point of service possibly win the RFP and then struggle to complete the work. We've had this happen a couple times, and on the back end, we're receiving phone calls to try to get things done in a timely manner. So we really want to focus on reference checks when you put out an RFP. Make sure that that organization has the capability to provide the remediation services. If their specific industry is not remediation, but they're going to take on the task, just make sure that the volume is going to be capable of being done within that period of time, because we've run into that a few times. Also, we've gone to some organizations and they're that win the business and the website's not even up yet. They're a brand new organization and the content of the website says coming soon. So those are some red flags that we try to reiterate. If you need the work done in a specific amount of time and you're looking for quality and you don't want to have to go back and forth, just make sure that these organizations really know how to remediate the documents. There are a lot of ways to check references, and there are a lot of ways to also check the tools that they're using. As Dave mentioned, there's a lot of great information out there and new solutions that are coming out. We're making so much progress in this area that it's always welcome to hear new tools that are coming, but we have to know that they can do the job. We have to know that when we test the document at the end, it's going to be compliant. We have talked to clients that have paid for services and it was not done correctly. When that happens, you have to remediate and that has to be paid for again. So it's really critical to do a thorough reference check and to find out exactly what they're doing in order to make the documents accessible. So some of the organizations that I work with are in California, and specifically California has to adhere to the WCAG standards. If a tool for testing or a tool for remediation is being used that does not adhere to those standards, you're not going to get the results that you're looking for. So I know that I have organizations that need to adhere to that specific standard, and if you're testing for something that doesn't check for that, then you're not gonna have a compliant document, and you're posting it, and once again putting yourself at risk for litigation. So we really try to stress reference checks and the tools that are being used. And find out more information about how they plan to remediate, how they plan to test for color contrast, how they plan to provide the alt text. These are all things that we've noticed aren't really specified at the beginning in the RFP, and at the end, it's one of those things that really affects the product that you get delivered. So Dave, if you want to go to the next slide, I think, unless you have anything to add on that one, Dave.
No, it's really quality, it's volume, it's do they guarantee their work? I mean, and finding those references, that's the hard part.
Perfect. So Dave and I have had many conversations about that topic. So just wanted him to chime in there. So in regards to fillable forms, we felt this was a strong enough topic that we should mention it here. Not all documents are created the same. And if you've ever done any type of remediation work or even had this type of work thrown on your plate, you'll see that the way that pricing is based, usually it's off the time that it takes someone to remediate a document. And fillable forms is a lot more complex and it just takes more time. There's a lot more details, and it's not something that can really be automated. So when an RFP goes out, you really have to explain the type of documents you have. We'll touch base on samples in a little bit, but the more samples that you can provide to a vendor and the more clarification on what is going to be entailed in this project is critical, just because no document is the same. And so if you are requesting a one-time flat rate price, and you have a variety of documents, it really changes the way that a vendor can respond, because that price needs to be balanced out with a basic document and something that's more complex. Dave, do you want to go? Do you have anything else to add on fillable forms?
Yeah, fillable forms. I mean, probably the biggest clue you're going to get with fillable forms, and just so we understand fillable forms versus print forms, because you see both. In some cases, an organization will have a form on their website, and it's basically something that's designed, you would print it, and then somebody would fill it out. So by definition and design, a print to fill form isn't accessible because somebody with a disability that has to print it, and then they would not be able to fill it out. Fillable forms by design, if properly tagged and properly set up for accessibility, are completely accessible, because you don't have to use a mouse, you can use a screen reader, and you can tab through the form and fill it out as intended by the designer. So that's why fillable forms are so critical to accessibility. But because fillable forms contain unique content, they may have radio buttons that you're not supposed to fill out, mutually inclusive or exclusive, so you can only select one button, or you can select as many that apply. Well, there may be scripting that needs to be written behind that, so that when you're using a keyboard, you can tab through that and fill that out without using a mouse. All those things taken into criteria. If you get an RFP out there and it contains fillable forms, and people are quoting $3, $4, $5 a page to do fillable forms, you can pretty much be assured that those are not being remediated properly. They're not going to be properly accessible fillable forms. And if you look at the range of bids in that area, you can almost differentiate who knows what they're doing versus who is not going to be able to do them properly based on the labor required to do those forms. So with that, let's jump into sample documents. Many times we talked earlier about these RFPs, if you don't give the vendors access to all of the documents, they're doing some of this blind. If you can't see the entire scope of the project, and you can't determine that exactly the number of pages it is, it's very hard to then determine exactly how much time / money it's going to cost to do the work properly, and then to be able to quote their best price for doing that work. So one of our recommendations is, obviously, if you can, and you should, provide access to all the documents before the RFP is due. Allow the vendors, if the documents are on your website, then refer them to your website and say, you can scan our website, find the documents, that's the scope of the project. Better yet, you have all the documents and you can then give them to the vendor or point the vendor to them so they can evaluate them before they do the quoting. But another good way to get an idea of the quality of what you're going to get back from the vendors is to create a sample document that you provide to all vendors and require that that sample document be remediated by them for free as part of the RFP process, as a sample of the quality of their work. And don't send them a long document. That's not fair to anyone, but you want something that contains the typical elements of the types of documents that are in the RFP. So if all your pages are scanned, then you need to send them a small scanned document. If it's a lot of fillable forms, you probably need to send them at least a sample of a fillable form. But you need to send a sample document that you can then get back from each vendor with the quotes that lets you evaluate then the quality of the work that they're going to be sending you for this large project. I mean, this is pretty much for large projects, not smaller projects. So not only do you want to get the sample document back fully remediated, properly remediated, so you can evaluate it, but then also, request what kind of report that they're going to send you to prove the compliance. So here's our RFP for, response, and it's X amount of dollars. And here's our sample document that we've remediated to WCAG 2.1 AA as per your requirements. And here's our compliance report showing that we've met WCAG 2.1 AA compliance. And if you get that from each of your vendors, you're going to have a really good way to know what you're going to expect when you award the bid to someone, of what the quality is, what the types of documents are going to come back looking at, how the reporting is going to show you and let you feel comfortable that the documents you've gotten are what you paid for and are not going to leave you liable. So let's talk about vetting vendors for a minute. As I said earlier, vendors are jumping into this field all the time. The most experienced vendors have been doing this for a long time, really since Section 508 came out in the early 2000s. Common Look is one of those vendors. We focused purely on PDF long before other people were working on PDFs. For a number of different reasons, that became our niche, and that's where our focus has been for the last 20 years. There's nothing wrong with new vendors entering the market, and it's great to see that there's that much interest in accessibility that there's more and more work now and more vendors entering the field. But you really have to make sure that they know what they're doing, that they can do the work properly, that you're getting what you're paying for and what you want to pay for, and that they are qualified to do the work. We're seeing vendors coming in, as Megan had mentioned earlier, that are coming from like document archiving or document storage or other systems that translation services that now want to move into ADA remediation. And so they'll write into their proposals and they'll write into their marketing materials, WCAG descriptions and compliance standards. But you need to find out that they truly know what they're doing. So when you get references, you need to call the references. You need to find out that they did exactly the type of work that you've put into this RFP. So if you're a government agency and you got a 10,000-page remediation project for WCAG compliance, you're going to want to find out from these other, some of the references that are supplied, did they do projects on the same size, scope, and scale, and to the quality that you're asking for in these references? I have seen RFPs where the references, or the project was over $1 million, so it was a very large project, and some of the references were that I did document remediation for $800 for this company or this organization. That's a very small project, and that is not a good reference for trying to win $1 million project, showing that you can handle thousands of documents to a high quality in a quick period of time. So you got to look for references that are equal and similar to the type of work that you're putting out into your RFP. And again, in vetting vendors, again, and I talked about this earlier, there's lots of fancy software tools out there, and AI, and we use algorithms. And I want to mention something. There's a big company who I'm not at liberty to mention their name, but everybody's familiar with them, who has been working with us on auto tagging into some of their technology. And it's difficult. And if a company of this size, with all the resources in the world, is finding this to be a difficult process, This goes to show you that this is a difficult process and that automation and AI is not going to be developed by a small organization very quickly to solve all the problems of document remediation. There's a lot to this. We've been doing this for 20 years. We've been involved with the ISO in developing the PDF standards for the world. And it's a complex process, and that's why there isn't going to be a quick fix for this. AI and automation has its place, but it can't be the only tool that you're relying on. Oops. So obviously we're doing all of this because the regulations demand compliance. And the big issue here is, if you don't have vendors that are doing the work properly, the liability is going to fall back on your organization. So you've paid to have the remediation done, and you now feel that what you got back is good, and you publish it to your website. But if there's a lawsuit that comes up because the fillable forms aren't fillable, and somebody with a disability now chooses to file a lawsuit against your organization is going to be on the hook, not the vendor that you outsourced the documents to necessarily, unless you choose to then go after them through the legal process. So it's best to get this right the first time, and you've paid for the work. You want to make certain that you don't have to go back and do the work again or find yourselves in a lawsuit. So let's go through the final recommendations, and then we'll get to our Q&A. So the first recommendation is you need to provide a simplified bid form for the RFPs. It needs to have the total page count on it. It needs to have the total scope on it. If it's an ad hoc bid, then you need to say, this is the types of content. I need a price per page for these types of content, so that you're comparing apples to apples. Our second recommendation is convert Office documents to PDF. That way you can ensure that they are all accessible. They can all be made to meet the standard, and you're in compliance. If you leave Office documents out on the internet, you can't prove that they are necessarily fully accessible. Office documents, like a Word document, can have all kinds of content pasted into the document that inherently make it inaccessible. So you can't force it to be accessible if it's got an inaccessible content in it. So converting it to PDF, it can then be made accessible. Continuing on with the recommendations, you need to list the total number of files and page counts for each of these projects. Without that scope of the project, it's very difficult for any vendor to give you a fixed price and you to feel confident that everything's been covered, and for them, quite honestly, to be sure that they've got all their costs covered by they knew the total scope of the project at the beginning. From a testing standpoint, using that Adobe Acrobat Accessibility Checker, there's nothing wrong with that. Continue to require that in your RFPs. But you need to consider asking the vendors to provide their own compliance report that shows compliance with the standards that you're asking for. If it's WCAG 2.1 AA or PDF UA, list that in your RFP and ask for a compliance report showing compliance checkpoint by checkpoint with that standard. If your vendors don't have a tool, they can use our tool. It's a free download. You need to check your references carefully. And when I say carefully, yes, you need to call them, but not just say, hey, are you familiar with this company? Did they do work for you? Was it okay? But was it the same scale and scope and size? What was the delivery time? How did you check the quality? All those different things. The references need to be on the same level as the kind of project that you're proposing. What we saw with some large RFPs this past year was that people, one business couldn't handle the work, and then the work was getting farmed out to other vendors across the board, and all those vendors that were doing that work were delivering variable quality. So the QA department had to go back and pull documents and send stuff out and pay for rework, and it was just a real mess. And so you want to get out of that. You want to make certain that the companies that are selected can handle the volume, can handle the documents correctly. Fillable forms, again, they're expensive to remediate. So you really need to acknowledge that in the RFP, that you're not asking for $3 a page fillable form remediation, but you're asking for the work to be done properly, acknowledging that we know the cost will be greater for that. Tell us what the cost will be. so that the forms are accessible and proper. And then the final recommendations, provide sample documents, or a sample document. If you can give us the whole scope of the project, that's great and that's ideal. But if you get that sample remediated document as an example of the work of each of the vendors bidding on the project, you're going to have a really good idea of what to expect if you award the project to the vendors. So you're going to have a good idea of what they deliver, how they're proving compliance, and you can test the quality, especially if you've got your own QA department or somebody that can test the documents for you. And then going back again, vetting again, ensuring those bidders, are qualified. They're legitimately qualified to do the work. It's going to save your agency time, money, and aggravation. Going back again to reference checks and the types of work that they're doing. So with that, we're going to go to questions. So I see I got about 4 questions right now. So let me click on the screen. The first question I have, it says, when services are provided by Common Look for fillable forms, do the remediators create the form fields too? And the answer to that is, if you give us a PDF form that is either fillable or wasn't created as fillable, yes, we will go through the entire process to make it a fillable form, including adding the form fields and all the other components of generating that PDF. We'll do JavaScripting on the form if that's what it requires. Again, it's very complex, but we've been doing this for a long, long time, and we have the skills and the background and the knowledge to do it properly. The second question that I have is, should the RFP ask for pricing by document or by page or by hour? And what's the best way to ask for pricing? I see often on RFPs where people will ask by the hour or an hourly rate, and we don't think that's really of any value in an RFP, because that's not typically how these projects are procured and how they're typically done. How these projects are typically done is a vendor or an organization will provide you with an actual document and say, this is my document, and it's 27 pages and it's got this types of content. And then that is normally broken down into a price per page or just the price to do that complete document properly. So I would be looking at pricing by document or a per page price for that document, but not look for an hourly rate, because again, that's going to vary and it's not necessarily accurate. You're not paying for an hour's worth of labor. You're paying to have that document remediated, whether it takes 20 minutes or 2 hours. The next question, it says, if I have lots of scanned pages, should I include that information in the RFP? And the answer to that is absolutely. Just so everybody understands, a scanned document is nothing more than a picture or a photograph of the document. They're created by copier equipment typically, and so now I have basically a PDF that's a whole bunch of images of the text and the graphics and the other stuff that's in the document. The only way to make a scanned document accessible is to run it through OCR, pull out, extract all the text, and then that PDF that's generated by running the optical character recognition tool is then properly tagged. And then once the tags are added, then you go through the traditional remediation process to make sure the tags are in the right order, that they're the correct tags, that there's alt text, that the heading levels are correct, and the reading order is correct. So all the remediation process occurs after you've taken the scan pages and OCR'd them. I got another question here. It says, if it's not technical illustrations, what is a fair price to charge for writing alt text for figures? We will include writing the alt text, if it's not technical, into the per page price. So if we're quoting a remediation project, we'll list out that we'll provide the alt text, and it'll be included in the cost per page for the documents. And so it's written into the price. It's not an extra charge normally for typical remediation. Where it becomes an issue is when it's those technical illustrations, when I as a remediator can't look at this document, look at these images, and accurately describe them because I'm not a aerospace engineer or, you know, somebody else that's technical, so I can't do that. So alt text is typically something that can be done through remediation as long as it's not technical and requires a subject matter expert. That's all I have listed right now for questions on here. Susan, did there any that came in through the chat?
No, I think we've taken care of all of it.
Excellent. Well, with that, Megan, any last words?
No, I don't have any last words. I appreciate everybody that joined, and hopefully this gives a little clarification on what is needed from a vendor's perspective on a response to an RFP, in hopes that you get what you want and we can provide a response that you want from the view of a vendor. That's all I have, Dave.
Very good. So with that, everyone, we will be sending out a captioned link to the video recording of this webinar. If you want to sign up for any of our other webinars that are still going on through the month of June, please go to our website and go find the Spring 2020 webinar series. And if you have any other questions or if there's content you want to see us do in future webinars, we're going to be looking at doing some in the summer and then some more in the fall. So if there's content you'd like to see, questions you need answered, please reach out to us at sales@commonlook.com and we'll be happy to take them in consideration. Everyone stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon. I appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Take care.